Okay. So thank you so much for having me here today. I'll just start by saying I'm not a physician, I'm a PhD scientist. So we're going to talk some science and we're going to try to make sense of that for what does that mean for patients and caregivers because we certainly do not have time to just keep on waiting until this is all sorted out. All right, how do I progress? Right here. Okay. Because I know it's been a long day, I thought let's start right out of the park with some things that we have learned from research. The research that we've done really in the space of cancer therapy is new, but the relationship between nutrition and cancer, just like Dr. Morrissey said, is not new. And so kind of understanding how these things help us as we move forward versus look back. I have done some research in kidney cancer prevention at NCI, National Cancer Institute, before I came here. But when I came to MD Anderson and I looked all around, I saw people walking around that already had cancer, and we didn't really have the answers for them. And that's really been the thing that I've been trying to do research to try and understand and address. But we do have a lot of evidence also from clinical nutrition. And so some of you may interact with them during your time at MD Anderson. And we know that we want to support gut health, we want to support the immune system, and we can do that by first starting by getting adequate intake, calories, protein, unless you've been told to lose weight by one of your physicians for a specific purpose. The purpose is really to stay where you are. Food safety, hugely important. I run MD Anderson's research kitchen. We feed patients on dietary clinical trials. We take this hugely seriously, as does inpatient dining services. We all follow the same rules. And you want to follow these same rules at home. The one thing I will say is some salads just aren't worth it. They don't provide a ton of nutrition for the volume of food that you're consuming, and they can have a lot of risk if they're not properly addressed in terms of washing. And you watch the news, you see where all this stuff is happening. Some other things are pretty straightforward. Generally, foods versus supplements, unless, again, some identified need for a supplement. If you have fatigue, concurrent loss of appetite, we really encourage people to eat more often. This is for our patients on our studies as well. Earlier in the day, anytime that you have that energy to eat, eat. And again, go for those nutrient dense small meals, small snacks, where you can get your nutrition all packed into the most concise bite possible. Now, one of my dietitians, research dietitian, was a clinical dietitian on the inpatient service. I asked her to give me a little bit more specifics. So we will not talk about specifics in the rest of the talk, but obviously there can be some very specific things that are going on in this particular space. Really, though, we will talk about the first thing, which is that the best options are often plant-based proteins and lean proteins. So when we're worried about protein, that doesn't mean we have to sit down to a steak or a slab of bacon, obviously. Of course, limiting sodium, and those for compromised kidney function, you may be asked to limit specific nutrients that could be in some of the foods that we're talking about today. And then any questions, you have inpatient and outpatient support from clinical nutrition. But what I found and what my clinical colleagues who are treating patients find is this is a pretty big question that comes up more than you would know. So you have your diagnosis, you've made your decision to start your treatment. This is the question. And it's kind of a black hole, right? And maybe we don't have a clear and direct, definite answer that everyone wants. And so what do? We get on the internet and we find a bunch of trash. And then we go out and we independently try some different diets. And we, as part of our research, we measure patients' diets. We ask them what they're eating. We screen them to see if they're eligible for our trials. We see a lot. And talking to clinical nutrition, they see a lot. These are the kinds of diets that we see out there. And I call it the fun wheel, spin the fun wheel. Let's try one. The reality is the evidence really is not there for the type of therapy you're going on, the type of tumor you may have. These are just ideas out there of a positive or even a safe effect. And everyone wants a secret formula, the acai berries or the special compound being sold on Amazon. Well, there isn't one. And we really don't have those kinds of answers because we don't typically, here at MD Anderson, we do now. But it was very rare for anyone to what I call assess diet in a cancer patient who's going on a clinical trial or starting therapy, or to enroll a patient into a clinical trial focused on diet. MD Anderson is changing the way. Now everyone wants to do it, but we had to figure it out first. So without that kind of data, what's the thing that we can safely do? And you heard this from integrative medicine as well, is that we extrapolate by providing the cancer prevention guidelines. And that's what she already went over, just in a different infographic. And a lot of these are the things that you already have heard about. They're very similar for cancer prevention, cardiovascular prevention, and even just the US dietary guidelines that we're all supposed to follow, no matter what we have going on in our lives. And of course, that's, eat a diet rich in whole grains, vegetables, fruits, beans, be physically active, be a healthy weight, limit consumption of heavily processed and fast foods, limit consumption or really no amount, and limit red meat, limit consumption of sugar sweetened beverages, don't need them, stay away from them, limit alcohol consumption, possibly no alcohol consumption, if you can manage that one. And then do not use supplements for cancer prevention. And then the kicker is if you can do all these things after a cancer diagnosis, do them. So this is what the guidelines are without specific studies and specific populations on specific therapies. If you look even further into the literature, where we look at what different dietary patterns have been associated with better rates of cancer survival in these observational cohorts, where we follow people who've been diagnosed or even before diagnosis, through survival. So lots of early stage patients in these cohorts. The blue circle is the cancer prevention diet guidelines we just went through. The purple is the only part that's really different with the US dietary guidelines that everyone's supposed to follow. And then on the orange and the green are some other diets that are have a lot of traction in this space. But again, they share everything in that blue circle. They just have other emphasis on other foods that have anti-inflammatory properties or that fit the Mediterranean diet pattern. Then over there in yellow is what I call restrictive diets. So those are diets that don't necessarily have any guidelines on specific foods, but they say limit carbs, don't eat meat, right? Vegetarianism, ketogenic, these kinds of things. But they are very actually flexible, which is why they're so attractive, but they are limiting something, potentially something you might eat. And how do we figure all this stuff out? We have these observational studies where we ask a patient, what are you eating? We watch, we observe, we don't do anything. And we see how those patients do compared to other patients. That's our observational research. Of course, we have colleagues in the lab that are doing all kinds of experiments in mice and other different types of preclinical experiments, and we learn a lot from those. And those two things generate really strong hypotheses for what we're going to move forward in clinical trials. And the mechanisms or the things that we try to target that are associated with nutrition and with the cancer experience are all those things across the bottom. So today I'll mostly talk about the gut microbiome, but actually these things kind of all overlap. Immune, inflammatory response, things like that. So about 10 years ago, or actually almost 12 years ago now, I came to MD Anderson from my cancer prevention background. And in cancer prevention, we talk a lot about modifiable risk factors. And that's what we build our careers on, trying to understand how to prevent cancer through modifiable risk factors like diet, which is what I was doing. But what do we do after cancer? Well, there's quite a lot of research out there showing, of course, that obesity and poor diet are not just important for cancer risk, but they play a role in outcomes, cancer progression and cancer outcomes. I will say with obesity, there has been some data that I've been involved in generating that shows that obese patients may actually respond better to immunotherapy. And there are some real mechanisms behind that. But generally, people who are obese also develop different kinds of tumors. So it's actually pretty complicated, that one, just like diet is complicated. But probably the most transitional thing in this whole topic of diet and cancer outcomes is the gut microbiome. So the gut microbiome is those bacteria that are living within inside you, and they have been strongly linked to therapeutic response and also therapeutic resistance and also toxicity. And so down here on, down here in the corner with all those bacterial names is a review of melanoma patients, including the big cohort here at MD Anderson that I'll talk to you about, kind of converging on these different bacteria that are associated with response in blue. I will tell you, as someone who studies this, a lot of those bacteria in blue play a strong role in the fermentation of dietary fiber. So I'll give you some more insight on that. And then the red ones are a range of different things that aren't necessarily pathogens. They just don't behave in the gut, or they play roles in promoting different types of inflammation or things like that. And then over here on the other side, I just wanted to go through some terminology that I'll be using today. Prebiotics aren't just a pill. Probiotics aren't just a pill. Probiotics can be things like dietary fiber and different nutrients and foods that the microbiome likes to munch on. Probiotics are live bacteria, which can be introduced any number of ways. Symbiotics are those two things working together, and postbiotics is how that interaction between those two things actually has an impact on the host. None of this matters unless it has an impact on you, the human. And this iceberg up here is that we know that age, sex, BMI, these kinds of things are body mass index are associated with different outcomes in our patients. And we're starting to understand that maybe some things kind of related to that at the bottom of the iceberg are things we can go in, understand, modify, and change to improve the patient experience. The problem is this microbiome, in addition to being incredibly complex, can be messed with a lot of other things that you have going on. So all different kinds of medications that you may be required to take can have a long or short-term impact on your microbiome. Diet is a major one that we can have some control over, but there are other things that we cannot control in the center, right? And so kind of understanding how all these things interact, and I would say that diet and stress kind of also go hand in hand. We can't uncouple those things either. And so we do work with colleagues at Integrative Medicine to try to understand those interactions as well. So this is kind of a scary figure, very sciencey figure. But what I want to show you is in the middle of all these different immune processes that are associated with cancer is the relationship between the gut and a lot of different nutrients. So those are things like vitamins, amino acids, even biosalts are related. All these different compounds are related to nutrition in, their effect on the microbiome, and those postbiotics, or those interactions that have an effect on the host. And so all these different things is why everyone is so excited about the gut microbiome and trying to understand how to affect it, because these things affect response, resistance to therapy, and toxicity that limits the ability to treat a patient. So let's look at some research. So when I first started working in this cancer outcome space, I started interacting with a team that was looking at the gut microbiome in patients with metastatic melanoma which are one of the first populations to go on anti-PD-1 immunotherapy. They were a team that I was working with as a scientist, and we talked about adding a dietary questionnaire, very simple dietary questionnaire to that particular cohort. It took many years to get the data and to get that paper published, but in the end, we got it published in Science, which is a really big, fat journal. And everybody saw it and everybody got excited about it. But basically what we found in that study is we had done a very early study in a small amount of patients, and we'd found this bacteria called Faecalibacterium that was associated with an improved response to anti-PD-1 immunotherapy. In this larger second cohort, not including the prior patients, we call that internal validation. We saw the same thing again. It's always great when you can repeat your own findings. We found that that bacteria and then another bacteria that was associated, Bacteroides, with the opposite non-response, were associated with these different tumor immune factors in the tumor itself. So we look at these things in the stool or the feces. And of course, that only matters, again, if it impacts the host or impacts the tumor. Then the other question in E was, okay, where are these patients getting their dietary fiber from? The good news is they're eating varied diets, they're able to eat varied diets with melanoma, and they're getting dietary fiber from a range of different sources. It's not any one special food or food group that this fiber is coming from. So when we looked at patients who met this threshold for sufficient versus insufficient dietary fiber, we saw the patients who consumed more dietary fiber at the initiation of their treatment did better, had improved progression-free survival. And then, that's just an observation, not cause effect. We looked at this also in a preclinical model and saw the same effect that was recapitulated in the preclinical model. We also did work looking at probiotic supplements, and we did not see a positive effect. My other colleague here at MD Anderson, Robert Jank, does a lot of work in the gut microbiome. He does a lot of work in stem cell transplant patients. However, the work that he's doing is relevant to all cancer patients, and that when we go on these different cytotoxic therapies, this is a little bit outside of immunotherapy, we can develop different toxicities or side effects. And one of the things behind that is that in our gut, we have an intestinal protective layer between what's going on in our gut and what's going on in the rest of our body. And one of the first lines of defense that keeps the bad bacteria from getting out into the blood is a mucus layer. And when the body gets into a state of stress, one of the first things it can do is it can get that gut microbiome to eat that mucus layer. And so a lot of the things that we're interested in doing with diet is sparing or preventing that process. What he found is that some of these cytotoxic therapies, when they restricted just caloric intake in the mice, so just stop eating, which is what happens a lot in the setting of cancer therapy, it had the same effect as the therapy itself. And of course, the two things combined had a very negative effect. So we're continuing to kind of study this in patients and to identify different ways to spare the mucus and to use the microbiome as a tool to do that, and by feeding it the things that it needs to keep it from doing that. So all this stuff is in other cancers so far that I showed you. So this work is definitely ongoing at MD Anderson to understand what are the targets in kidney cancer patients that we want to go after here. And that work is being conducted by Dr. Campbell and Dr. Sfederko in my department. And we are collecting nutrition data in the patients enrolling onto those studies. But other cohorts, just like the melanoma cohort that I showed you, have found different bacteria that are very similar to the ones that I've seen in melanoma and with Dr. Robert Jank that are involved in these same processes. So Faecalibacterium, Akkermansia, these bacteria associated with improved response. And so some of this I do think can extrapolate, but we're really going to try to answer this in our own patients too. So if the gut microbiome is so important, diet is not the only way to change it. However, these other methods that people are investigating, like fecal microbial transplants, not a patient's favorite concept. Also using different probiotics or different mixtures of live bacteria given as a supplement. All those things, I would say, let's remember what's in the background. A patient is not a mouse or a vacuum. A patient goes home and eats a certain diet. And so I don't actually think of all these things as independent. I think we should do everything possible to understand this and figure out how to change it. And my job is to still figure out what is the best diet, whether it's on the foreground or the background to support these strategies, because I know changing diet is not easy. And so we've done several trials here at MD Anderson. One of the first things we do in trial, figure out safety and feasibility and get all the kinks out before we take it into an active treatment population. So we've done that in several studies. And Diet 2.0, which is down there at the bottom, was a study that was originally done in melanoma patients, a trial, a high fiber feeding trial based on the data from the science paper. We did enroll some renal cell carcinoma patients there at the end. So although they were not the primary patients in the trial, we did collect some data in those patients with Dr. Tanner. So it'll be interesting to see what we find. But we've also done some other trials to try and understand what is the best dietary intervention method that works within a patient on active therapy. So there can be a great idea that patients just simply can't follow during therapy. The stricter the intervention, the less flexible it is, the harder it is for patients to do that. So we're thinking about the science, but we're also thinking about what can you do? We don't want to make this any worse than it already is, emotionally, physically, for your family, for you. So we're also trying to figure out what's an effective method, but what's a method that can be sustained. And that was built on another study that we had done. This was in a survivor population with colorectal cancer that had, I think like many other patient populations, joint issues, managing gut health and metabolic health. So they came from a place where those two things needed to be improved. They were on metformin, they were on statins, they had overweight, obesity, central obesity, and of course they've had colorectal cancer and they're struggling with their diets. So we really carefully monitored their side effects and we fed them beans. And what we found is just giving them a cup of beans, up to a cup of beans every day for 4 to 8 weeks. We had different measurements. We saw that they actually increased a lot of those healthy bacteria without making any other changes to their diet. And again, bacteria, super, great, fine. We also saw changes in what we call the circulating markers of the interaction between the diet and the microbiome, which is the metabolome. And we also saw changes in other biological immune and inflammatory markers that suggested that just the beans alone weren't having the intended effect. One thing I want to point out, though, is that this was a crossover trial where patients ate the beans as they were instructed, met with the dietitian, got through all the side effects, got through all of that, and then they went back to their usual diet, and they didn't have to eat the beans. And we saw all those good bacteria shoot all the way down, even further than we got them up most of the time, of 4 weeks going back to their usual diet. So again, the importance of making a change, but being able to sustain that change, because we certainly wouldn't want to put a patient on a diet trial, pull them off and leave them on therapy and watch all those good bacteria that they need to mount a response tank down. So that's really the method behind the new trials that we are launching in melanoma and hopefully someday can launch in other patient populations. We have to start in the place we have the most safety data, efficacy data, and funding. And so we're starting these prebiotic food enriched diet trials, which is kind of a hybrid of that BEGON or BEAN trial and the work that we've done with the high fiber feeding and all the lessons we've learned from the science, but also the patient experience, because our goal is to have like a program that we can deliver in parallel. Just like if you were diagnosed with diabetes or inflammatory bowel disease, you'd be referred to a nutritionist, you'd sit down, you'd have a plan, and you'd do that alongside your treatment. That's the dream, that's the goal. Insurance covers it. We have a long way to go to get there, but that's our goal. And none of this would be possible without the medical oncologists that I work with and surgical oncologists, Jennifer McQuaid and Jennifer Wargo, both in melanoma, but they do science across the spectrum. So I think we'll see more happening in other cancers. So just to finish, here's some of the things that we're thinking about over here on the science side. So the gut microbiome is important, the diet's important. Should we try to understand these two things? Should we prime them? Should we fix them somehow before a patient starts treatment? If we use some sort of method of, fancy method of changing the microbiome, how do we sustain that? Does it matter what the patient eats after we introduce all these new bacteria? I would argue yes. All of the data suggests it does. So thinking about how different drug therapies, different gut microbiome therapies, and how diet fits into all that in the background. So final thoughts are that, all the evidence for cancer prevention, cancer treatment kind of converges on this idea that gut health, metabolic health, immune health is all built on this diet that meets your needs, but also emphasizes specific kinds of fiber-rich foods, foods that really stimulate the immune system. So I'm going to skip along and just give you a couple examples, and I will reiterate also what we heard from integrated medicine. Ultra-processed foods aren't just lacking in nutrients, they have additives that challenge gut health. And these are other things that we're studying in science. Here's some examples of some different snacks. Foods that provide, like we talked about, those efficient snacks, right? Foods that provide protein, fat, fiber, all in one. And foods and snacks that are complete. And I'll just say oatmeal is great. As a caregiver, I make people eat a lot of oatmeal. And you can have it savory, you can have it sweet, you can do a lot of things with oatmeal. And then, of course, all these other ideas down here. And I know a lot of people always ask me, what's a label on the diet you recommend? So I made up one. It's Mediterranean diet with focus on protein. And here's some evidence-based resources that I would suggest when you're doing that Googling, hit these, not the others. And that is it for me. And I'll let you get one more picture of that slide, okay? And obviously, thank you. Thank you so much for your time and your energy. Thank you.